The early days were marked by urgency and raw emotion. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods, retraced Andrea's final steps, and spoke to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Tips poured in, some credible, others born of speculation. Yet as the hours turned into days, the tone of the investigation began to change. What had initially seemed like an open field of possibilities gradually narrowed into a single, dominant theory. Once that theory took hold, alternative explanations appeared to fade into the background. Leads that did not fit the emerging narrative were quietly set aside. Questions raised by inconsistencies were labeled misunderstandings. To Andrea's family, it felt as though the search for what happened had been replaced by the effort to prove what investigators already believed. In the months that followed, public statements grew more confident, even as private doubts lingered. Media coverage echoed official conclusions, reinforcing a version of events that left little room for ambiguity. But for those closest to Andrea, uncertainty persisted. They revisited timelines, re-examined evidence, and asked why certain witnesses were never called, why some forensic details seemed unresolved. The case became more than a criminal proceeding. It became a struggle over interpretation. Was justice defined by a conviction or by certainty? Could closure exist if lingering questions remained unanswered? Each development brought renewed hope, only to be followed by fresh frustration. Years later, the story of Andrea Alber's death continues to raise uncomfortable questions about investigative momentum, confirmation bias, and the fragile line between confidence and certainty. For her family, the pursuit of truth did not end with a verdict. It remains an ongoing act of remembrance and insistence, a refusal to let the complexity of Andrea's life and the mystery of her death be reduced to a single, unexamined conclusion. Instead, the revelation was met with hesitation. Rather than treating the unknown DNA profile as a pivotal breakthrough, officials framed it as a complication, something to be interpreted within the boundaries of the existing theory rather than a reason to re-examine it. For Andrea's family, this was the moment when doubt hardened into alarm. If the science did not align with the narrative, shouldn't the narrative be questioned? The DNA did not arrive quietly. It carried with it the weight of possibility, the possibility of another presence, another sequence of events, another truth waiting to be uncovered. Independent experts urged a broader review. Advocates called for transparency. Yet the institutional response seemed measured, cautious, almost defensive. Motions were filed, statements were clarified, but the fundamental premise of the original case remained largely intact. To outside observers, the resistance was difficult to understand. In modern investigations, DNA is often described as the gold standard, impartial, unyielding, immune to bias. If it pointed somewhere new, why not follow it? Critics argued that reopening the investigation fully would not signal weakness, but integrity. Justice, they insisted, should be resilient enough to withstand scrutiny. As legal appeals unfolded, the case took on a second life in courtrooms and public discourse. What had once been framed as a closed chapter now felt unsettled. The unknown profile lingered in the background like an unanswered question, challenging the finality of earlier conclusions. For Andrea's family, the issue was never about revisiting pain for its own sake. It was about clarity. They did not seek to undermine justice, but to ensure it was complete. Because when new evidence emerges, especially evidence as consequential as DNA, the measure of a system is not how firmly it clings to its past decisions, but how honestly it is willing to re-examine them. Court hearings no longer revolved solely around what happened to Andrea, but around what the evidence meant, and who had the authority to define that meaning. Each filing added another layer of interpretation. Defense attorneys pointed to interrogation tactics, inconsistencies in timelines, and the absence of definitive physical links. Prosecutors countered with contextual explanations, arguing that complexity did not equal innocence. Observers found themselves pulled into opposing camps, often shaped by which narrative they encountered first. To some, the idea of a coerced confession fit a troubling but familiar pattern. To others, The presence of unresolved forensic details suggested a crime broader than initially understood. The same pieces of evidence were arranged into different pictures, each claiming coherence. As years passed, memory itself became part of the dispute. Witness recollections evolved. Experts revisited earlier analyses with updated methods. What once seemed settled grew porous under scrutiny. Appeals and counter-appeals transformed the case from a single prosecution into an ongoing examination of process, how decisions are made, how certainty is constructed, and how difficult it can be to unwind either. Through it all, Andrea remained at the center, even as her story was refracted through legal arguments and public debate. The deeper question persisted. When facts are filtered through institutions, procedures, and human judgment, how do we distinguish between resolution and reassurance? The answer proved elusive, and the search for it became almost as consuming as the original investigation itself. Yet, even that development did not bring immediate clarity. While prosecutors described the arrest as a decisive turn, defense attorneys urged caution, emphasizing that an arrest is not the same as a conviction. The evidence, they argued, would need to withstand the same scrutiny that had complicated earlier proceedings. For Andrea's family, hope was tempered by the painful awareness that breakthroughs can still be followed by long, uncertain legal roads. The alleged links, DNA results, digital records, and the recovery of a weapon believed to be connected to the crime, appeared, on the surface, to form a cohesive narrative. Supporters of the renewed investigation saw this as the moment the case finally aligned with the science. After years of ambiguity, there was something tangible, something measurable. But as hearings resumed, familiar tensions resurfaced. Questions emerged about timelines, about how and when evidence had been collected, and about whether earlier investigative decisions had delayed this outcome. The courtroom once again became a forum not only for determining responsibility, but for dissecting the path that led there. For Andrea's loved ones, the emotional toll was profound. Each proceeding reopened wounds that had never fully healed. They found themselves navigating cautious optimism, wanting to believe that this time the answers would hold, that this time the evidence would speak clearly and conclusively. Whether the arrest of Chadwick Mosley ultimately resolves the long-running questions or introduces new ones remains to be seen. What is certain is that for those who loved Andrea, justice is not measured by headlines or announcements. It is measured by truth, fully examined, transparently tested, and strong enough to endure doubt. News of the escape spread quickly, transforming what had been a methodical legal proceeding into a spectacle. The man now at the center of the case was no longer just a name in court documents. He became a figure defined by pursuit and recapture. For Andrea's family, the headlines were exhausting. Each update pulled the case back into public view, often stripped of nuance and reduced to dramatic fragments. Investigators, meanwhile, faced renewed scrutiny. Questions resurfaced about how the earlier evidence had been handled, how investigative priorities had been set, and whether institutional blind spots had delayed identifying him. The fact that forensic links now appeared strong only deepened the mystery of the intervening years. Was it a matter of technological limitations at the time, overlooked connections, or something more systemic? Legal experts cautioned against conflating flight with guilt, noting that while escape can influence perception, it does not substitute for proof in a courtroom. Still, to many observers, the act seemed to reinforce the seriousness of the allegations. Public opinion shifted once again, shaped as much by emotion as by evidence. Through it all, Andrea's loved ones remained caught between hope and fatigue. The case had evolved from tragedy to controversy to near cinematic drama, yet the core question remained unchanged. What truly happened, and can the legal process deliver an answer that withstands time? Until that question is settled with clarity and finality, closure remains just out of reach, a promise glimpsed, but not yet fully realized. Those early gaps became their own source of controversy. In complex investigations, it is not unusual for dozens of names to surface in preliminary interviews. Friends, acquaintances, co-workers, anyone who might have crossed paths with the victim. But the distinction between being mentioned and being formally documented as a suspect can be significant. If Chadwick's name circulated informally yet never advanced to a structured review, critics argue that the oversight demands explanation. Some point to the realities of time pressure. In the first days after a violent crime, investigators must triage leads quickly, often relying on incomplete information. A tip that lacks immediate corroboration can fall behind more urgent avenues. Others suggest that once the focus narrowed to Kenneth, investigative momentum may have unintentionally sidelined alternative threads. Confirmation bias, even when subtle, can shape which questions are pursued and which are left dormant. The absence of clear documentation has fueled public skepticism. Records create accountability. They show not only what was pursued, but what was considered and dismissed. Without that paper trail, the narrative becomes vulnerable to doubt. Were opportunities truly missed, or does the record simply fail to reflect the full scope of early inquiries? For Andrea's family, these are not abstract procedural concerns. They represent lost time, months or years during which different decisions might have altered the trajectory of the case. Each unanswered question reinforces the sense that the story of what happened in those first critical days is still incomplete. As proceedings continue, the scrutiny has shifted beyond individual culpability to institutional reflection. What systems are in place to ensure that early leads are preserved, revisited, and transparently documented? And if mistakes were made, how does a justice system acknowledge them without undermining public trust? In the shadow of Andrea's death, those broader questions remain intertwined with the search for accountability. For Kenneth, the passage of time has carried its own consequences. Years spent under accusation do not simply disappear with a new conviction. Reputations, employment prospects, personal relationships, all are shaped by the shadow of a charge, even when the narrative shifts. Exoneration is not only a legal milestone, it is a social and psychological one. The process itself is exacting. Courts must balance finality with fairness, weighing whether new developments fundamentally undermine earlier conclusions or merely coexist alongside them. Prosecutors may reassess prior positions, but they are not automatically compelled to concede error. Judges must consider procedural rules, evidentiary standards, and the integrity of prior proceedings. Each safeguard exists to prevent rash reversals, yet those same safeguards can slow the path to correction. Chadwick's conviction introduced clarity about Andrea's death, but it did not automatically resolve every legal question tied to Kenneth. The law often requires more than implication. It demands a clear showing that prior findings cannot stand. That threshold can be difficult to meet, even when public opinion has shifted. For Andrea's loved ones, this prolonged process extends an already painful chapter. Justice, in theory, should bring resolution. In practice, it can unfold in stages: conviction, appeal, reconsideration, formal declaration. Each step carries weight, and each requires patience that can feel almost unbearable. Kenneth's fight for full exoneration underscores a broader truth. The legal system is designed to be deliberate, not swift. Whether that deliberation ultimately delivers restoration will depend on how the courts reconcile past decisions with present realities, and on whether the system proves willing to distinguish between closure and correctness. The psychological toll of such a prolonged ordeal cannot be overstated. For someone accused of a violent crime and subjected to years of legal uncertainty, the experience often reshapes identity and relationships. Living under scrutiny, facing public judgment, and navigating restrictive conditions can create feelings of isolation and mistrust. Even when legal outcomes change, emotional and social recovery is rarely automatic. Stigma can be especially durable. Communities may struggle to separate allegations from later developments. Employers and acquaintances may hesitate, not out of malice, but uncertainty. Opportunities that might have existed years earlier can disappear, not because of a formal judgment, but because of lingering perception. Rebuilding requires patience and resilience, and even then the result may not resemble the life that existed before. At the same time, justice systems impose such burdens for reasons tied to due process and public safety. Serious allegations demand careful examination, and procedural safeguards exist to prevent wrongful outcomes. The challenge lies in balancing those safeguards with recognition of human consequences. When someone spends years under accusation only to be cleared or partially vindicated, society faces the question of how, or whether, to acknowledge the damage done. For families like that of Andrea Albert, the prolonged process is painful in a different way. Their search for truth and accountability unfolds in public forums and legal documents, often over many years. They confront not only the original loss but also the complexity of the justice system's response. Closure, when it comes, may be partial and hard-won. These realities do not negate the importance of rigorous legal procedures. They do, however, remind us that criminal cases involve human beings, victims, accused individuals, and communities, all affected by outcomes that extend beyond courtroom verdicts. The psychological and social dimensions of such cases deserve thoughtful consideration alongside the legal ones. The passage explains how forensic science, especially genetic genealogy, can revolutionize investigations by linking crime scene DNA to relatives in public databases, eventually identifying individuals, such as Chadwick Mosley. This method has solved cold cases, but it also shows limits. DNA can prove presence, not context or causation. Scientific evidence must be paired with timelines, witnesses, and other proof to avoid misinterpretation. The case involving Andrea Albert illustrates both confidence in scientific evidence and caution about how it is gathered and applied. Ultimately, modern justice relies on technology as a tool, powerful but imperfect, and on human judgment to balance factual discovery with fairness and due process. Forensic evidence, including the contested hair and blood evidence, can be powerful but must be handled with strict protocols. Contamination or misinterpretation can distort results, which is why chain of custody records and independent review matter. DNA and biological traces show contact but not context. They cannot alone explain how evidence arrived or what events occurred. Debates about the hair sample reflect broader concerns about accuracy and transparency. Science improves over time, but repeated testing and poor handling can complicate results. Ultimately, evidence must be evaluated alongside other facts to reach fair and reliable conclusions. For the families affected by the death of Andrea Albert and the proceedings involving Chadwick Mosley, the goal is truth and justice through careful, balanced examination of all information. Public perception has shifted significantly since the initial conviction. Where once many believed the case was closed, now there is widespread debate. True crime communities, legal analysts, and investigative journalists have revisited the timeline repeatedly, pointing out inconsistencies and asking whether tunnel vision influenced early decisions. As January 2026 approaches, anticipation surrounding the second trial continues to build. Legal experts predict that the presence of a convicted perpetrator tied to definitive DNA evidence will dramatically affect the proceedings. Whether the prosecution can sustain its theory of joint responsibility remains to be seen. Andrea herself, however, must remain at the center of the story. Beyond the legal complexities and courtroom strategies was a young woman with dreams, uncertainties, friendships, and a future ahead of her. Her life was more than the circumstances of her death. Remembering that is essential. Her family's resilience through years of legal turbulence speaks volumes. They have endured shifting narratives, painful testimony, and public scrutiny, all while trying to honor Andrea's memory. For them, justice is not abstract. It is deeply personal and long overdue. Ultimately, this case stands as a cautionary tale about the justice system's fragility. When investigators lock onto a single theory too early, alternative possibilities can be overlooked. Correcting those mistakes can take years, sometimes decades. Whether Kenneth is ultimately exonerated or not, the broader questions raised by this case will likely echo far beyond one courtroom. It challenges institutions to balance certainty with humility and reminds us that the pursuit of justice must remain open to the possibility of error.